Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 6th Praxis Roundtable, hosted by the World Bank here in Sydney in partnership with The Diplomat magazine. My name's Ian Gerard and I'm editor of The Diplomat. As always, I'd like to extend a special welcome to everyone watching at home on APAC and over the internet, or listening on radio across the whole Asia Pacific. Today's topic is technology. In the last 2 decades or so, technology has become an integral part of our professional and personal lives in the West, both as necessity and luxury. The recent launch here in Sydney of the latest iPhone is a case in point, generating plenty of media attention. However, it is the positive impact of technological growth in the developing world that should be garnering the headlines. On the panel to discuss this are Margaret Duckett, CEO of the Australian Foundation for the Peoples of Asia and the Pacific, Jonathan Greenacre, Director of StepSafe, the Australian Youth Against Landmines Association, and Greg Tucker, who is the joint owner of Payments Services Limited and the Regional Director for Money Mover Systems. Last year, Andrew Burns, the lead economist at the World Bank and author of a report on technology in developing nations, said, "Technological progress is ultimately probably the most important driver of incomes, of growth in developing countries." According to the report, technology has spread faster in emerging economies than in rich nations, and technological growth has helped raise incomes in developing nations and reduce the share of people living in absolute poverty from 29% in 1990 to 18% in 2004. The role and scope of cyber-based social networking sites has received significant attention recently thanks to the use of the likes of Twitter by anti-government protesters in Iraq to counter the official line. But it is the mobile phone, the cell phone, that best symbolises global advances in technology. Today, some 80% of the Earth's population lives within range of a mobile phone network, with lives and businesses transformed as a result. At the first of these roundtables, the issue of remittances was discussed. Traditionally, sending money home through official channels was a time-intensive and commission-heavy process. Now, though, remittances can be transferred via mobile phones, saving time and ensuring more of the money reaches the family members in need. An extension of this is the expected growth of mobile financial services, something that is already popular in Africa. The consultative group to assist the poor estimates that by 2012 there will be 1.7 billion people worldwide who have access to a mobile phone but not to a bank account. Mobile phones are therefore starting to be used to buy and sell produce and products, anytime, anywhere. Mobile phone technology has also been utilised to help developing nations prepare for disease threats such as a new strain of swine flu or the increased spread of HIV. This is a logical step, given that there are an estimated 2.2 billion mobile phones in the developing world, along with 305 million computers, but only 11 million hospital beds. Mobile technology can connect rural areas that need healthcare with doctors in urban centres. But despite these and other advances, such as the ability of aid agencies to respond more quickly and directly to disasters and emergencies, the UN's International Telecommunications Union published a report in March this year showing that the digital divide between rich and poor countries still exists. The report said, despite significant improvements in the developing world, the gap between the ICT haves and have-nots remains. It's time to hear from our panellists now, and then once we've heard from each of them, it's time for everyone in the room to have their say. I'll be inviting questions from you, and that's your opportunity to add your thoughts and ideas to the debate. Our first speaker is Margaret Duckett. Margaret has been CEO of the Australian Foundation for the Peoples of Asia and the Pacific since March, bringing with her over 25 years' worth of experience in the health and social policy sectors at all levels. Margaret has been a government advisor, academic and consultant, and has worked for numerous international organisations, including the WHO, United Nations Development Programme and AusAid. Margaret.
Thank you. I titled my talk, Technology and Development, Inherent Conflict, ? Because it often is seen that introducing technology into a number of developing contexts is very, very difficult and it can be counterproductive. And so what I thought I'd do is do a very quick canter through 3 different types of technologies, which is going to be interesting to do in 5 minutes, but I'm hoping we might have questions and explore some of them in greater detail. First one I wanted to talk about was the use of geographical information systems. In Vietnam we have a program of dengue fever prevention, which basically involves introduction of a little tiny shrimp into water jars to eat mosquito larvae, so dengue fever isn't transmitted. We're currently operating in 12 communes in the Mekong Delta, and that reaches about 120,000 people. And workers go round to the households in the different communes and check that the little crustacea has been put in every single water jar for the household, and that therefore there's no mosquito larvae around to start transmitting dengue. We had an Australian volunteer spend 12 months mapping all the historical data that had been gathered over the last 5 years with that project, and doing a whole spatial mapping so that now, every month, the new data can be assessed against the historical data, and the people in the health system can see that commune is falling back a bit, or that part of that commune is falling back a bit in dengue fever control. It's also a technology that can be used for surveillance and checking and prevention, really, of most infectious diseases. Most transmissible diseases can use a similar type of geographic information system to map prevalence and to follow it up. Second one I wanted to do a quick canter through was a cyclone monitoring system called APSEDI. It can be accessed on our website. We currently have 2,500 subscribers, but the numbers rise dramatically during cyclone season, and we've maxed at 20,000 hits during active cyclones over a 24-hour period. And basically that was established because meteorological officers put out highly technical information, and what we saw as a need was to translate that into understandable language by most people, and also working in close partnership with a number of 10 partner countries in the Pacific, is to say, right, the cyclone's hitting there. That's not such a problem because there's hardly any population living there, it's just going to hit the rocks. Or, oh my goodness, that's going to hit high population. We need to get warnings out, we need to have preparation in place in case the worst happens. So APSEDI's gone on to be not only a cyclone monitoring system, but also general disasters, looking for lost ships, all sorts of things have been using that APSEDI thing. And the alerts go out in both English and French. People can request which language that works for them. So we hope we've covered, at a higher level, most of the Pacific Island countries. The third thing I wanted to talk about was use of technology with food drying and solar food dryers. Our Zimbabwe partners have created solar food dryers using steel and glass rather than the scrap wood and metal that it's usually used in village level. It allows for much greater control of the quality. In Zimbabwe, it's been used very much to promote the use of indigenous vegetables and the local herbs and weeds, which are very important on a medicinal and a nutritional basis, particularly in a country like Zimbabwe, where the political environment has led to lost food security for a lot of people. In the communities we've been working with, the food security, number of months of food security per year has increased. And that is a major outcome, given the surroundings. And what's happened there also is that our Zambian partners gone to Zimbabwe, had a look at what they were doing, and after a few visits we gave them one of the solar food dryers to take back to Zambia and use with their projects. The local engineers have now done a couple of improvements so that in Zambia they're now using solar battery operated food dryers, which means that even during the wet season you can use the solar food dryers, have much greater control of time and temperature, and therefore it makes it much more usable year-round. That's not only for the use of the households, of course, but their income-generating activities for those people in terms of market opportunities. So that was a very quick canter through a couple of different uses of technology in countries that I think are relevant to Pacific Island countries.
Lovely, thank you very much, Margaret. And as you said, hopefully we'll have a chance a bit later on to hear a little bit more about each of those three developments. I'll turn now to Jonathan Greenacre. Jonathan is a lawyer with Clayton, as well as the director of StepSafe, which he was inspired to set up after visiting a Cambodian landmines aid centre in 2003. StepSafe aims to provide small-scale strategic financing to humanitarian programmes in Cambodia, and the organisation now has members in Sydney, Chicago, Philadelphia, Richmond and New York. Jonathan.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to discuss how 21st century technology can be used to help small-scale part-time organisations like StepSafe to expand internationally. Just as background, as Mrs. Gerard just said, StepSafe began very small, about 6 years ago, when a few other students and I got together and started fundraising for programs in Cambodia. But in the last 2 or 3 years, we've started using a range of technological devices to expand internationally. And as Mr. Gerard said, we now have about 15 contributing members, and although we're currently operating out of Australia and the US, we're exploring expansion opportunities in Europe and Japan. It's my view that about 15 years ago, an organisation like StepSafe couldn't really function and expand very well because we don't have much resources. We all work full-time, most of us as bankers and lawyers, and we have no full-time staff. So as a result, we've had to use a variety of 21st century technological devices to expand and function. By 21st century technology, I mean the sort of instruments which have really only taken on widespread usage in the last 7 or 8 years. So that includes mobile phones, particularly the use of international text messaging in developing and developed countries. The use of Skype, which as most of you probably know, involves talking one computer to another, often using a hookup with a big video camera at times, and also widespread email access. So I'll also do a little bit of a canter through 5 particular items of 21st century technology that we use to expand and grow. The first is email, which is the obvious one. Email is very helpful for us because it means we don't have to talk to each other very often. And that suits us fine because our timetables are pretty much completely incompatible. We're spread across 3 or 4 time zones, and even those who live in the same city often can't talk to each other very often. And that means that entire relationships between members have been driven predominantly or exclusively via email. So, for example, the StepSafe secretary and I communicate almost entirely through email. She's a hard-working lawyer at Malleson's law firm, and we rarely get the chance to meet. I'd say in the last 3 years we've probably spoken for a total of about 10 hours, but exchanged about 1,500 emails, and through that we've managed to move along just fine. Unfortunately, sometimes we do have to speak, and that's when mobile phones become particularly useful, particularly international text messaging. Through international text messaging, we can organise times to talk to each other and cancel at the last minute if necessary. The third item is Skype, and in this instance I want to talk about it just in terms of one computer to another. Parents amongst the audience might have experienced the sort of talks whereby a child's calling from a backpacking trip in Zambia, and it actually adds to the conversation and the comfort if you can see the person on the computer screen talking to you. I think it's funny, it's like your brain is tricked and you're thinking that you're having coffee with that person, even though the person's calling from the other side of the planet. So I've had some relationships with other StepSafe members that have really deepened through the use of Skype and that way of being able to see the other person. For example, the StepSafe US chapter leader and I have actually met each other in person probably twice in 2.5 years, but through seeing each other about once a month using Skype, I feel that we've developed a degree of intimacy and trust. The fourth item is something I have to use when my trusty microphone breaks down when I'm trying to talk through Skype, which happens quite a lot, and that is instant messaging. For example, recently I was talking to a new member from Richmond in Virginia who I really wanted to impress, and sure enough my microphone broke down. But luckily we both had instant messaging, and so although our conversation wasn't quite as fluid as if we were talking directly, we could still introduce ourselves and explore opportunities for working together. Finally, I want to return to Skype again, but this time talk about it in the context of holding group meetings, so across multiple computers. This has been really interesting because Skype is so handy because it's free and you can use it through the internet, and all of our members have access to the internet. And in this instance, I've been in quite an awkward position because I'm the only member of the StepSafe executive who's met everyone else. The two other Australians and the two Americans haven't met each other. So at first our quarterly group meetings were really dead in the water and I had to talk the whole time. But over the last year or so, I've watched as the barriers have broken down, as people have got used to talking to each other. And now people are quite happy to exchange their ideas, and so those meetings are a lot more productive. And one of the StepSafe members actually said to me a couple of weeks ago, "It's great, we all get along so well." And I thought it's interesting because he hasn't actually met 40% of the people who we've been talking to all this time. I know that was a bit of a rush, but I just hope I've given you an example of a small-scale part-time organisation which uses 21st century technology to grow and expand. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Finally, I'd like to introduce Greg Tucker, who is the joint owner of Payment Services Limited and the Regional Director for Money Mover Systems. Greg has spent 24 years in the financial services industry, with the last 11 spent specialising in the consumer and business remittance and billing industries. He has worked for Western Union covering the Pacific region, also worked for Travelex and New Zealand Post, which is where he gained his first introduction to the remittance and billing industry. Greg.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks very much. Well, I've taken a slightly different tack today in that I want to have a look at some of the issues that we face trying to introduce new technology into areas such as the Pacific. I mean, we can all agree that technology has brought wonderful changes to all of our lives and the way that we live our lives and the way that we work. Can any of us imagine living without a car, without a computer, a phone or a TV? The introduction of a technical solution has dramatically changed the way that we work and live, and it's made our jobs infinitely easier and faster. And I say that reservedly because some might disagree with that. The speed in turn creates new opportunities, however, and the faster we can get something done, the more productive we become. That means we can get more of it built, created, serviced. That leads to increased profits, and that leads to the item or the service generally becoming cheaper. The reality is technology is everywhere and is deeply involved with almost everything we do. So as often the case, when we look to improve the lives of some of our less developed neighbours, or simply to grow our market share, we look to technology to provide a solution. And in many cases that works well and everyone benefits. However, what is often overlooked is the environment that the technology is being placed into. And I'm not talking about the physical environment. Is there a stable platform of electricity? I'm not talking about stable internet connectivity. Excuse me. I'm talking about the people, the actual people infrastructure who will end up using the technology. If we take any one of the Pacific Islands as an example, Samoa, Tonga, Fiji, we see a culture that is still firmly fixed in the traditional village and extended family atmosphere. The members of the village take time to look after each other, and they take time to look after the well-being of their neighbours. In many cases, the village and the elders within the village actually have the authority to overarch the local law, and they have the ability to judge and pass sentence on some of the members of the village that may have strayed from the straight and narrow. When times get tough for a family in the village, the other members come to their aid, knowing that when the situation is reversed, the reverse will happen and they'll receive the support. Generally, the level of support each family is expected to provide is based on how well off they are and how they're placed in the economic situation. Of course, none of this is written down. This is historical practice and has been going for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It also explains why, in so many cases, you'll find many different families working in the same sort of business. A wealthy business owner who belongs in a village or lives in a village knows that the more secure the members of the other members of the village are, the more financially secure they become, the less support he's going to have to provide in bad times. That means he ends up with more money. It's quite simple. That's where we run into a problem with technology, coming back to the technology side, because when you're talking to a business owner in the Pacific about some whiz-bang new technology that can save time, it can make things cheaper, it can reduce the amount of human interaction required in the process, you're often met with a very uninterested stare. because you're actually taking away those jobs that it's critical for him to create. So technology doesn't always get that hurrah response. All that said, the introduction of new technology is often driven by changes in market conditions. And certainly over the last few years, we've witnessed this throughout many markets, including the money transfer industry. Customers are becoming better educated and are demanding more convenient methods for transactions. Again, if we take the Pacific as an example, increased competition has started to reduce the retail price of transfers. And in an effort to lower the costs, some of the existing operators and a number of the new operators coming into the market are introducing new single brand forms of technology, and they've been able to move a certain portion of their customers across to this. Unfortunately, though, they tend to be reasonably limited as to what they can offer, because generally they rely on the same technology or the same brand being available at both ends of the transaction, in both the send country and the receive country. You know, an X-brand cellular phone to an X-brand cellular phone as an example. Single brand services can provide a solution. However, if they really become successful and they start to dominate the market, we get back into that situation where they become a monopoly or a duopoly starts to be created. The fact of the matter is today that the market is still dominated by cash-to-cash, person-to-person transactions. And for that to happen effectively, you need trusted retail locations in both the send country and the receive country to pay out the money. The issue here is the fact that the large majority of the retail chains that are really trusted and able to do this work, and here I'm talking in particular about the postal organisations, are currently locked into anti-competitive long-term exclusive contracts, in particular with one large US-based player. And it's fair to say that organisation certainly isn't in the game to introduce new technology or lower costs. Unfortunately, the regulators in virtually every country have ignored this highly anti-competitive practice, and as a result we've been left with much higher prices and less choice than otherwise would have been the case. Sadly, in just the last few days we've seen that situation become even worse right here in the Pacific, with that same operator buying out their largest agent in the Pacific region. So that now means that one company now has direct control over the vast majority of transactions that occur in around about 9 Pacific countries. There are companies out there trying to launch new multi-brand technologies which will undoubtedly lower the cost of transfers and offer customers greater choice and convenience. However, if they're going to be effectively blocked from entering the markets due to these regulators' inactivity or the decision by the regulators not to get involved, then the introduction of that technology is going to be slower, it's going to be much further off, and the benefits everyone will see from the introduction will be lost. Thank you.
Lovely, thanks very much, Greg. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time now to invite questions from the audience. Alita's going to come around with a microphone, so if you could raise your hand if you've got a question, and then when she reaches you, if you could stand up and say your name, where you're from, and then launch into your question, please. So has anyone got a question?
Peter Herborn from the University of Western Sydney, and Margaret talked about geographic information systems, and one of the things that concerns me about the use of geographic information systems in a development context is the dominance, I suppose, of very large organisations. So we're talking about proprietary systems, and I'm just wondering about the potential for sort of ownership and public participation in GIS in developing countries like Vietnam.
I suppose we've been using them in the context of Ministry of Health and the government departments doing that. So we haven't been working down to alternative supply of GIS. It's really been at that public health level of being able to use them to monitor. You can use them in all sorts of ways: remote sensing, land surveying, aerial photography. All those things are GIS software, but I can't answer your question specifically at all.
Just a comment. There was a piece of research in Cambodia using GIS, and it was a very successful one because it used the technical side and also local knowledge. So the local people contributed their knowledge of where the mines were, and that was combined with the military who had their perspective on where the mines were. And it also acted as a check on the corruption that sometimes occurs when the military knows where the mines are and what areas have been cleared. So I think there's potential, but whether it actually gets achieved, I think can be quite difficult.
Yeah, I mean, the GIS system can also be used by emergency planners to calculate emergency response time for a natural disaster, etc. So the limitation is on who's using it for what purpose, which is always the basic issue with any technology, of who's controlling it, as you raised, and who's participating in its use. And I can't give an answer on that one.
So is this new technology, Margaret, or is it something that's become just more widely available in the last few years? I mean, thinking particularly about the cyclone monitoring system that you mentioned, could that have been used 2004 for the tsunami? Is it the similar kind of technology?
It's a similar type of technology. It's just actually trying to use it better for developing countries and not only in developed countries. And that's why I chose the examples I did, because the GIS has been used in developed countries a lot, but not all that much in developing countries. And it's really getting that concept of how you can map data of any type to make planning decisions much easier. And with the new developments in technology, with BlackBerries, with a whole range of things, you can start doing it in handheld level. So you can, use it in a disaster situation quite easily.
And setting that up, does cost become an issue there with regards to, does the government of the day need X amount of dollars in order to be able to do this?
Well, the GIS system in Vietnam, that was organised by a one-year volunteer from Australia. So that was relatively cheap both to Australia and to Vietnam. Taking all the historical data and putting it together in a software package, we've then ran training workshops for public healthcare workers in the Vietnam Ministry of Health. So they now know how to use it, how to enter the data and compare this month's data with previous data. So in actual running, it's relatively cheap, as long as the technological companies keep the system working. It's cheap to use, cheap to run. And I suppose that's also then part of where my organisation is coming from. We've been operating for 41 years. We pride ourselves on trying to think of innovative ways to use technology to transfer south-south knowledge. So I'm trying to do a promotion for the idea of GISs in a number of Pacific Island countries. The idea of doing solar food dryers, drying indigenous food and local herbs, etc., using the new technology of steel and glass rather than your old technology, the old traditional ways of drying it on the roadside, etc. So it's most of the things my agency does, we do everything on the smell of an oily rag. So it's designed never to be expensive in the country you're trying to transfer it to, or to not even transfer, to raise the idea of with our partner NGOs in other countries.
Yeah. Time for another question, please, from the floor. At the front here.
Thomas Ernst from the World Bank. I just have two quick questions. The first one's actually for Greg. Greg, I think you hit the nail on the head. Really alarming issue here in the Pacific. Remittances, $500 million US a year going into the Pacific, but issues you raised about issues with regulatory complexities, lack of transparency sometimes in terms of duopolies, monopolies. And so I guess my question is, what is it that development organizations like the World Bank or IC can do to sort of try to combat this issue? Like, should we be providing technical assistance to regulatory authorities? Should we be going out and delivering financial literacy programs in Pacific communities to try to create that demand for cheaper products? So that's my question for yourself. And just a quick question to Jonathan. He talked a lot about information communications technologies, but If I understood, your organization is also trying to raise capital to provide to organizations in Cambodia. So I'm curious, what about websites like betterplace.org? Are you using these websites to try to help raise capital for yourself and targeting some of these really interesting websites now that are using technologies for asking everyday ordinary Australians to provide small loans to people in developing countries? So outside of the ICT part of it, is your organization also looking at websites like betterplace.org? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Maybe if I go first. I think the World Bank has a very large role to play, certainly with lobbying local governments around their need to probably look at ways that places like the postal organisations, for example, have a far greater role in society rather than just making money. That they also have that social policy and social agenda which they should really be looking at and looking at ways of promoting new technologies coming in or making the way clear to allow these sort of new technologies to come in and be used and utilised. Certainly through education, we have seen the education of the common remittance customer, if there is such a thing, has been raised over the last few years. But again, it's one of those things that it's an ongoing process. The normal remittance person is someone who's a recent migrant, and so it's an ongoing education campaign that's required because you've got a new audience all the time coming out. Generally, with remittances, we find people will stick to a brand because they've looked after, or that brand has looked after them in the past, and so up until now they've just tended to go with that quite blind faithfully. That's something that has to change. People need to have a place that they can actually talk to their neighbours, between the villages, get the word out there that there are different alternatives. Smaller companies and companies that are offering technology often don't have the resources behind or the ability to go out and get that sort of message out there, and that's certainly something the World Bank could help with. John.
Thank you for the question. I suppose in a short answer we're not, but we probably should be. We probably should be exploring some of the innovative fundraising avenues you talked about. We have a pretty conservative approach to fundraising in that because most of us are lawyers and bankers, we actually tend towards seeking funds from those groups, partly because we feel that given our background we can sort of connect and talk the same language. But in terms of exploring new options like yours, that's something I'd be interested in looking at. Thanks.
May I follow up a little bit, because it's maybe my mindset in the organisation I'm with, but I also see a vast untapped potential of doing things community level and tapping the benefits of working as community, and in many ways that's where our cyclone monitoring system comes from. That was developed in partnership with NGOs in a number of Pacific Island countries with seed funding from AusAid, but it's maintained now by a volunteer. It's supported by volunteers in those countries, and so it's self-maintaining as it stands now, and can and is being used by a number of countries at that thing. So there's also the option of really looking at what are the strengths of the countries. Can you tap on things other than monetary level to really put something together that's going to work very well for a community and an economy? Because I see a cyclone monitoring system as really helping future economic growth, particularly with climate change. So it's sometimes also a mindset issue.
Sure.
Greg, I've got a follow-up question for you. We were talking before we started recording about the discrepancy that exists between sending money, say, from Australia to Samoa and sending money, remittances from Australia to Vanuatu. Given that, and also the sort of virtual monopoly that you're talking about that's developing in the Pacific region, is there a danger of people turning more and more to those informal remittance channels that are open to abuse and corruption, and money gets siphoned off here, there and everywhere? That must be a concern to...
Well, in actual fact, it's a double-edged sword, because it's a double concern. Yes, you are dead right. People are being driven to those less formal channels, the non-reported channels. Secondly, as and we've certainly seen the change in the market since 9/11, the increased regulations and requirements for the recognised or authorised transfer partners or organisations to actually, the level of complexity in reporting that they now have to accommodate from the 9/11 as a result of 9/11 has put their costs dramatically higher. So it's actually been a double-edged sword. It's the authorised organisations, their costs have gone up, and so more and more money is going to that underground or the informal channel.
And would the gradual development of mobile technology, would that eliminate that? Would it make it worse? What's the prognosis for that?
It certainly will help.
Yeah.
I see cellular as definitely a way of the future. But my concern, though, is and the gentleman from the university raised it before, when you start talking proprietary software, and it's those large organisations that can put out that large proprietary software, they can back it up with the large advertising, we could be in danger of heading down to another monopoly duopoly, different from the one that stands there today, but another monopoly all the same. It's just using different technology.
Can we have another question from the room, please?
I'm Hans Zehr. I work with ASAI. We are a community development organization, also focusing on infrastructure. I've worked in ICT for development in the last 6 years. One of the key issues that I always come across is the level of skills transfer that's required on a local level. While we're talking about technology solutions, often budgets don't get allocated for skills transfer on the local country level. I'd like to hear your experience on each of your technologies that you mentioned, and also are these lessons learned being shared around? Because the risk is always, as we all have experienced, there's projects that have done exactly the same thing, and the lessons learned don't get shared. I know there's lessons learned available on, for example, international websites, but we're really keen on getting some Australia-Pacific kind of information out there as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Margaret, did you want to fill that?
All right, I'll start with that one. The APSEDI, the cyclone monitoring system, we've described that whole approach and what's happening in a publication put out by the UNDP, and suggested that the whole approach could easily be transferred to other island developing areas around the world, so the Caribbean or etc. Yes, you have to think of the skills transfer. You have to work out what will work in the country you're working in. How do you interpret what's required? How do you present it in a way that makes sense for the education system, for the surrounding environment in which you're working? Yes, always. And sometimes you forget to put that into a funding proposal, etc., and it's, oh, right, we need to work out how to do it. But our organisation prides itself on trying to get a south-south transfer of technology. So it's not so hard in many ways with the technology transfer, because people are talking in often ways about the same mindset of the environment in which we're working. Because another example is we support a community radio station in Zambia, and there's a community radio station in Solomon Islands that's about to be established. We're getting one of the experts from Zambia to go later this year to Solomon Islands to spend a couple of weeks sharing the lessons they've learned from Zambia, when now the Minister of Communications in Zambia requires anyone seeking a community radio station licence in Zambia to go and spend some time with Chikuni, and then go home, set up their community radio station, and then someone from Chikuni has to go and sign off that they know what they're doing, they've designed their programs to really involve the community, etc. So it helps if you do south-south transfer of technology rather than north-south transfer of technology.
Jonathan, is this an issue that affects StepSafe? Great.
Not really, primarily but because of the regulatory controls around money transfer market in particular. The organisations that we're dealing with can't really be a community-based organisation. It really has to be more of a commercial enterprise. And so, yes, while we can move the technology across to them and the skills, it doesn't really have to go any further out to the community, because the community will come and use the service at that point of transfer.
Jonathan, I'm interested in what you were saying earlier, that we know that StepSafe was set up in 2003. when you were in Cambodia. If you'd been there, say, a decade earlier, do you think you'd have been as motivated to set this up, given that there isn't the technology with which to communicate and to enable you to do, a semi-full-time job but on a part-time basis? Was that something that was in the back of your mind when you were there in Cambodia?
I think I would have been more motivated to set it up 10 years ago, given the prevalence of landmines in Cambodia was even worse back then. So I think the motivation would have been stronger, but I think it just would have been almost impossible. I think that we probably could have done some of the fundraising that we've done in Australia, but like I mentioned in the speech, I just don't think it could have expanded it internationally. Because I wouldn't have had the time to get around the problem of exchanging information and communicating with people overseas. It's just been because of the sort of technological devices I mentioned earlier, which has made it convenient enough so that I can work as a lawyer and do this outside of work hours.
And has it helped you in terms of getting people coming to you through having a website, for example? Even in Cambodia, are you reaching people in Cambodia who've been directly affected by landmines?
Yeah, well, we don't actually... Originally, we focused specifically on landmine survivors, but something we learnt is that most programs in Cambodia don't focus specifically on landmine survivors, so they may work with, say, the disabled generally, which includes landmine survivors. And we actually do most of the attracting ourselves because over the time we've been working in Cambodia, we've come to terms with the level of corruption over there. And so we have very specific channels of who we reach out to and how we support them.
Another question from the floor.
Just to follow up on that, I think that's very interesting when you say accountability and dealing with local interest groups. One of the key areas is what we identified is that looking at a quid pro quo, what's in it for the local counterpart and the local partners. I mean, each one of you must have had some experiences of what motivates a volunteer on a cyclone warning system, or in your case also on the money transfer. Could you just share a little bit about your insights on what motivates a local in-country partner to stay on the line, stay accountable, and stay responsible on fulfilling your goal that you had on this initiative?
Mine's very, very simple. Normally money. We are dealing with commercial organisations, and probably it's that money that's caused the biggest problem. The likes of the big money transfer companies can create a lot of income for the business partners in the country. They tend to give some fairly good sign-on bonuses and so forth for these organisations to join the party. And so it tends to purely simply be money. And unfortunately, that social agenda tends to be put out the back because they can make a lot of money. Now, it's not necessarily their fault, because these days more and more governments are expecting from their quasi-government departments or NGOs to actually earn money, and they've got to be profitable, they've got to be a profit centre in themselves. And so their board is tasked with going out and earning commercial contracts. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is that social agenda is getting put further and further on the back burner.
I think my answer would be similar to Greg's, but with a slight variation. With respect to the World Bank and the United Nations, at StepSafe, we actually aim to try to fill gaps that are sometimes created by institutional donors. So we feel that there's extra incentive for our NGO partners to remain accountable, because we can be a last gasp funder. So we've actually found that levels of accountability have been quite high, because we provide quite tailored support.
AFAP is a bit unusual in that we don't have offices all around the world. Vietnam is the only country we, in fact, have had an office since '95 there. But we generally operate by having like-minded NGOs in country and them approaching us about the things their local community wants to have happen. And then we'll facilitate finding some money for that. And as part of that, we then have quite detailed memorandums of understanding of how we'll be doing that, exploring what capacity building needs to be put in place, often around financial systems. We do the regular monitoring. We have standard forms to fill in. And apart from that, we also have something that's somewhat similar to the StepSafe, we provide an opportunity for interested Australian members of the public to be what we call our community partners. So they might be passionate about particular programs in particular countries. So Ethiopia, we have a partner, Hope for Children, which works with children in Ethiopia. They have fundraising here in Australia, and then as a community partner of ours, we help with the transfer of the money to those partners, but also are engaged with the Australian groups who are fundraising. Will also be going to their project in Ethiopia, to visit, to monitor, to discuss what needs to happen. But as our role is, and is required by AusAid, we also need to go check how the systems are in place, monitor what's happening, ensure that they're following Australian policy issues like child protection policy or environment issues or family planning, and there's a whole range of policies. So it's, as a good friend, you help with money, but you also help with giving advice on what systems need to be put in place, how you might need to operate, what the transparency and accountability you need to have in place. Now, once you get that happening well, those NGOs are then often in a better position to apply directly to other donors for funding as well. So AFAP prides itself on our partners are really good now at sustainable development, because we might work with them and really help to empower them, and then they can go out and get a whole range of other things. And the programs that we put in place 10 years ago are still running, but they're self-funded or they're funded from other things. We don't need to keep holding their hands on those sort of things. So that's where, AFAP has been operating for 41 years. We have 7 staff in Sydney. We're working in 27 countries. You don't do, when I say we run on a smell of an oily rag, we run on the smell of an oily rag. But it's because you're working in country, it's a bit slower to get things happening, but because you're working with an organisation where they're passionate about what's happening at their community level, they're driving it. We're not driving it from our end.
Any more questions from the floor, please?
Thank you. My name's Frank Hutchinson. I'm actually jointly from the University of Sydney and the University of New England. The question I have relates to the context in which technology is used, and I was really encouraged to kind of raise this question by the 2 questions that you raised, Margaret, and that was who's using it and for what purpose. And I think they're really important questions, but I would perhaps like to even go back further and ask the question of what kinds of technology, what kinds of technology are being promoted. Now, most of the technologies that we've talked about today are forms of communications technology. The question I'd ask is for the panel to address in terms of sorts of development processes that we're interested in. What do we envisage as the kinds of technology that are particularly important in the next, say, 10, 20 years in terms of bringing about the sorts of changes that we'd like to see in terms of a more just, peaceful future for the peoples of the Asia-Pacific region? Thank you.
Greg, would you like to fill that one first?
Goodness. It's going to be interesting. I can certainly see as infrastructure is developed through a number of the countries, and particularly with the Pacific, that there's going to be, I know we're talking about particularly communication technology at the moment, but I really see that as one of the key drivers going forward. That the communication can be used in varying what forms to educate people. It gets that level of public knowledge out there, whether it be knowledge transfer as far as medicine, whether it goes into education and actually bringing the education and the medical benefits closer to the people where they live, rather than the person having to travel. Interesting situation we have with, if I bring it back to money transfers, is worked with a number of companies that have had some wonderful ideas of having buses, money transfer buses that will drive around the villages in the likes of Samoa. And they'll pull up at the village and everyone comes out and you go and see if there's a money transfer there for you. And these organisation I was working with thought this was a wonderful idea, and this would bring, using technology and a different type of technology to actually bring the transfer and make it more convenient for the end consumer. What we had to quickly point out to them, though, was that it's all well and good the person receiving the money in the village, but there's no shops in the village to spend the money at. So the person has to jump on the bus, they have to go into town to find the shops to then spend the money to buy the groceries to take back to the house anyway. So simply just bringing in mechanical technology for the sake of it isn't necessarily the case. Bringing in the education so they know that there's a transfer there, so they don't have to catch the bus in twice. Now there's a different thing altogether. So it still probably comes back to the communication, but using that communication for far broader reasons than are probably being used today.
Jonathan.
Yeah, well, I don't really have much to add to Greg. I mean, I guess the focus of my work has been surrounding StepSafe, and so as that communications technology continues to develop, that enables the sort of groups I was discussing, groups like StepSafe, to function more effectively. I've been very glad to see the growth of the BlackBerry market and similar devices, because it means that people can ever more readily access their emails and communicate, which helps groups like us to function more effectively. So more of that sort of technology, I think, is going to be very helpful.
I suppose I always operate as technology as a tool. It's not an end in itself. They are the basic questions: who's using it for what end? And so you always have to look at any technological thing as a tool. I see internet, Skype, all the rest as making it easier to transfer information. And information is different from knowledge, and information also then needs to be adapted to the local environment to be really worthwhile. And so you can transfer the information, but you have to have your local people really thinking, right, how is that information going to make a difference to us? What are we going to do with it? Because every community is different. You always need some adaptation to make a positive difference and to try and minimise the negative things as much as possible. And it is that whole philosophical approach to seeing technology as a tool, not as a god in itself.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. And I'd like to finish just by talking about, we've been sort of talking about the advantages of technology and how much good technology can do in terms of alleviating poverty, in terms of improving health services, education as well, in terms of distance learning is wonderful. But also, this is more for Greg and Margaret in terms of the amount of time that you've spent in your given fields. Is technology necessarily good? Were things done better 25 years ago? I'm going to throw a curly one in here, for example, talking about the development of Wi-Fi. And we've got a report from the BBC that says there's a real danger that they will drive a model of development, in this case based around Wi-Fi hotspots and unlicensed radio spectrum, that fits their own commercial interests and ideological position instead of being what developing countries really need. So is there a danger that we, particularly in the West, in the developed world, are almost saying, we've got this wonderful technology, now you must use it, without necessarily thinking, is it the right thing to do?
I'm very aware of that with some countries like Vanuatu, countries that have an oral culture, and a theatre group there was great in providing all sorts of health information through acting in the different local dialects and providing it all. Radio was less immediate. TV is even further less immediate. And therefore, sometimes when we start using technology because it's easier, we lose the very thing that we were trying to promote. And the interaction with people, the oral culture, is really what needs to be promoted. Not just, it's easier to use radio and TV and reach a larger amount of people, but you don't reach them in the same way. So I will say that from long years of experience.
Sure. I think just adding to that too is that all too often we find that this is the way we do it in the States, so thou shalt do it this way. And it doesn't have to be the States, it could be from New Zealand, Australia, or anywhere. Developed countries tend to try to impose their technology and the way that technology is used as the be-all and end-all. As Margaret said, it should be used and looked at as a tool, which then has to be customised very heavily into that local culture. Similar to what I was talking about before in my talk, that it may not be good, it may actually bring in other problems that weren't foreseen in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, this same report, it says that the digital divide, which I mentioned in my opening remarks, it's still there, and it's still very much a serious barrier to economic development, which is, I guess, something to address. Ladies and gentlemen, that's it for this Praxis Roundtable. Thank you very much for coming along. You can view this Praxis at www.worldbank.org/PI or at www.the-diplomat.com. There'll be another Praxis next month. Thank you very much for your attendance, and thank you, of course, to the panel, to Greg Tucker, Jonathan Greenacre, and Margaret Duckett. Thank you all very much. Thanks.